I'm joined today by Ilan Berman, Vice President of the American Foreign Policy Council in Washington, D.C. Ilan, I've been reading so much of what you've written about the Iran nuclear deal, and I guess it's not unfair to say that you have a sort of more alarmist point of view than I do, although, to be perfectly clear, I share many of the sort of systemic concerns that you have around Iran and around security in the Middle East. Let's start sort of top level, which is what are your biggest concerns with the deal as we understand it now?
Well, as we understand it now, and I think that's a good caveat because the deal that we're going to get isn't modified really from its original form. The back and forth that you saw over the last several weeks on the Hill could have resulted in a process where there is some amendment, there is some change to sort of to the contours of the deal, but the electoral math was such that what we saw at the outset, what we saw announced in July, is pretty much what we're going to get in terms of implementation. And as far as I'm concerned, that's reasonably problematic because the deal that was outlined over the summer really empowers Iran in an entirely unconstructive way by funneling these massive amounts of previously frozen funds, funds that Iran had generated over the last several years as a result of oil revenue. It funnels it back to the Islamic Republic, and it's going to fuel a whole series of things, including an uptick in Iran's sponsorship for terrorism. So, on that level, we have created a mechanism by which Iran's threat potential is poised to grow pretty dramatically.
Do we have, I want to focus in on, well, I mean, there's a lot of things to focus in on, but one of the things you mentioned is Iran's support and funding of terrorism. There's no question that Iran ideologically supports both Hezbollah and Hamas. They've also, we know about the connection to Hezbollah's attack on the Jewish community in my home country of Argentina in 1994. I understand all of that, but do we actually know of a financial link beyond a shadow of a doubt? I've read things on both sides, but it's not even clear to me that while they ideologically do support many of those movements, that they're actually funding those groups today in a direct way. Correct me if I'm wrong.
No, no, there are links, and a lot of it obviously is hidden behind top secret classifications. But there's a lot of open source information that's available out there talking about the scope of Iran's assistance to Hezbollah, Hamas, and others. And one of the sort of perhaps the most recent, and it's useful to sort of to look at, was a memorandum that was commissioned by Senator Mark Kirk of Illinois from the Congressional Research Service. And he asked them, after the deal was announced, to attempt to estimate how much Iran spends every year on support and fomentation of instability through these avenues, through others. And the numbers that came back were really quite staggering. And it wasn't one number, it was a range. It was a range of between 3.5 and $16 billion a year. And those are astronomical sums, and it's a very wide range, but it depends on what you count in the mix. Is it just support for Hezbollah, which is roughly $200 million a year into the organizational budget, or does it also include support for Assad's regime in Syria, which the U.S. Treasury has estimated at $6 billion a year? Whatever the statistics, we're looking at a situation where Iran, which is constrained still by sanctions today, is spending a tremendous amount of money on precisely the type of activity that we're seeking to stop.
To sort of set the context for our audience as far as where you are on this, if we imagine a sort of spectrum where on one side you say we should not even be putting any oversight time into what Iran is doing with enriching uranium, and the far opposite side being, I guess, in a sort of thought experiment point of view, let's take military action right now. Where on that imaginary spectrum are you with regard to what should be done today?
Well, I'm far more skeptical about Iran's intentions globally than the administration is, and I err on the side of moving in the direction of constraining Iran financially. I wouldn't say that I'm ready to jump on the bandwagon of military action today, but I do think that we're sort of heading in that direction because the deal is such that it really limits our options moving forward. Because in addition to expanding Iran's ability to do harm through its proxies, it doesn't really roll back Iran's nuclear program. In fact, it slows down Iran's development, but it doesn't really dismantle any infrastructure. So um, I would like to avoid that binary choice where we either have to accept a nuclear Iran or bomb them to prevent it. But if I was forced to judge, I would err on the side of being entirely skeptical about Iranian intentions and capabilities.
I want to get to that skepticism in a second, but I recently interviewed Frank von Hippel, who's a science advisor to both sides, and I'm sure no matter what one's opinion is of this deal, it's hard to deny that it has become incredibly politicized. And the idea of interviewing Frank von Hippel was, let's just focus on the science if we can, to the extent that that's possible. And he made it pretty clear that the gap between the uranium enrichment levels that Iran is allowed under this deal and the point at which we are even remotely close to anything that could serve as a pretext for enriching uranium to weapons grade level is so stark that there is essentially no way he can imagine, based on what we know about on the record and clandestine sources monitoring what Iran is doing, that Iran could sort of surprise anybody with weapons grade uranium. That was the science perspective from a scientist involved in this, Frank von Hippel. So what's your reaction to that?
Well, so I think that's true as far as it goes, but it's only part of the story. And I would add sort of two caveats to what Frank told you. So first of all, one of I think the structural flaws in the deal is that it doesn't actually prevent Iran or dismantle Iran's capability to develop a robust offensive nuclear capability. It just
sure, but
I
mean, not to interrupt you, but this is a similar argument to the one we hear around gun control in the U.S., which may resonate with you. I have no idea what your views are on guns, but we often hear, hey, laws around guns don't prevent criminals or people who want to break laws from doing anything. That may be true, but that's not the only function of restrictions, right? The point is, and I think this is so important, whether you want to go in the direction of military action or not, if you have rules and then can point to Iran having broken those rules, you create a more legitimate pretext to do whatever it is you want to do, be it further sanctions or military intervention, don't you?
No, true, right, and you've actually slowed down the sort of the speed at which Iran can develop a nuclear device. But I'm someone who really likes to take U.S. government officials at their word. So it's hard for me to square what this deal actually says, all things being equal, with the notion that President Obama not too long ago talked about this deal as closing off all pathways for Iran to get a nuclear weapon. And frankly, this is false on two levels. First of all, we haven't prevented them infinitely or ad infinitum from developing a nuclear device, right? We just slowed them down. And the second is, and this is where what we talked about earlier, the sanctions relief becomes really important. There's really only two ways that Iran can get a bomb. They can build one or they can buy one. And we have provided Iran with a tremendous amount of capital that's going to be flowing to the Islamic Republic shortly, within the next 6 to 8 months. And this is capital that's going to be used, frankly, on everything, because the scope of the relief that they're going to get is such that it equals roughly a quarter of their entire federal budget for last year. And that amount of cash, even if only a small portion is used for terrorism or a small portion is used for nuclear development, can really empower Iranian activities on that second clandestine path. Iran is going to have more resources, maybe not to build a bomb, but certainly to buy one.
But this sort of supports what my view is even further. And my view is that we should absolutely be very weary of what it is that is happening in Iran, but that this deal, no matter what your view is as to what tactic we should take with Iran happens to be, it creates very clear guidelines while including the sort of benefit of charity, which is, listen, let's give them the opportunity not to break these rules. I think that whatever ultimately ends up being the course with Iran, this is a deal that provides the opportunity to legitimize whatever action is ultimately taking by giving them the opportunity to see what they do with the money and setting very clear guidelines as to what they can and cannot do.
Well, no, I think that's true, again, as far as it goes. But So virtually everybody I speak with here in Washington is convinced that Iran is going to violate in some way. Given their past history of nuclear development and diplomatic behavior, Iran may not break out and sprint for a nuclear bomb, but they're likely to inch out in 1,000 different ways.
And
And in
because the
fact,
science experts tell us that that would be a relatively slow process, wouldn't that be exactly the opportunity, whoever it is wants military action or whoever it is wants further sanctions, to point and say, now we have a reason to do it?
well, and here's the diplomatic dilemma,
Yeah.
right? So we have an administration that has effectively locked itself into this process where the administration is incentivized to ignore precisely those violations. One of the really important overlooked elements that could have been included in the deal but wasn't was this idea of scalable responses, of tactical ways by which the administration can penalize Iran for inching out towards a nuclear capability. Right now, we don't have any of those. The administration has not talked about it publicly. The administration has not laid out a public statement by which the Iranians are put on notice that here's what's going to happen if you violate. And as a result, we've sort of we've locked ourselves. We've gotten stuck in this cycle by which Iranian tactical violations are already happening. In terms of lack of oversight, in terms of dual-use shipment of Mirage steel, things like that. We don't have a response to that short of walking away from the diplomatic table altogether. And it's patently clear that the administration, after sinking so much political capital into this deal, isn't prepared to do so. That's really a mandate, I think, for the Iranians to go slow, but to cheat as rapaciously as possible.
All right. Yeah, I think we just, we'll have to sort of agree to disagree on that particular thing. I think when you say, hey, here's the very low number to which they're allowed to enrich uranium, here's the very high number that would make it approach weapons grade. If they go anywhere beyond the low number that would be for clear research and peaceful purposes, that's a violation. I get what you're saying. The specific responses are not necessarily spelled out in the deal, but I guess I'm just not as concerned about that particular thing as you are. But for people who want to find out more about Ilan Berman's view on this, the book is Iran's Deadly Ambition. He's the vice president of the American Foreign Policy Council in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for talking to me today.
Oh, thanks, David.